circulatory bed in the body. It is a complex, multiply bifurcating, beautiful, if you're me, looking lattice. And just to illustrate that point, I've got an electron microscopy of frog lung, and then in red, something I'm quite proud of, it is a live, intubated, ventilated mouse pulmonary circulation with 2-photon microscopy that I took when I was working in San Francisco, just to show you that we can get as beautiful images in real time from live animals as we can from dead frogs. One of the reasons that the lung is special and that lots of what we know about inflammation cannot be extrapolated from the systemic circulation is that it's very different. And just to remind you of some of the ways in which it's different, the site of leukocyte extravasation in the lung is actually the pulmonary capillaries rather than the post-capillary venules in the systemic circulation. That necessitates some other differences, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but one of those is that actually the rolling tethering paradigm that we talk about for cell extravasation in inflammation in the systemic circulation is not possible in the lung. The pulmonary capillary diameter is about 5 micrometers, and actually the diameter of a neutrophil is 7 to 10 micrometers. So there's just no room for the kind of rolling tethering paradigm that everybody thinks about. The other thing that's different is that the pulmonary capillary endothelium expresses different cell adhesion molecules compared to the systemic circulation. And by that I mean that whilst extravasation of inflammatory cells in the systemic circulation requires integrins, so CD11b, CD18 dependent, actually integrin independent mechanisms exist for some stimulations for extravasation in the pulmonary circulation. So the mechanisms by which cells leave the bloodstream and the ways, the site in which they do it, are very, very different in the lung compared to the systemic circulation. Just one of the reasons why the lung is special. So the lung in sepsis is the topic of the talk, and I guess I'm the first person to tell you that sepsis is a really big problem, about 270 per 100,000 person years. But even though I'm a lung doctor and think lungs are really important, even I have to concede, whilst lung sepsis is a really big problem, actually lung failure as a result of sepsis, so the secondary phenomenon, actually isn't quite such a big problem as sepsis. And we need to have a little think about why this might be the case, and that's where I thought I would focus my talk. I could give you a lot about primary lung infections and nosocomial infections, but the role of the lung in host defence is what I thought I would focus on. So the kind of model that I wanted to explain and provide some evidence for is summarised here. So in health, the lung, which sees the entire cardiac output, is very well placed for immune surveillance. By that I mean it can take blood that's relatively uninflamed, it circulates normally, it makes sure that everything's okay, and just allows it to continue on its way. We've known that the lung operates in this kind of way from people who have AV malformations, and the fact that they can get cerebral abscesses when the pulmonary circulation is bypassed. The lung acts in a kind of filter way, but I think is a bit smarter than that. What I'm proposing is that actually in sepsis, the lung can note inflammatory cells, selectively hold on to them, facilitate their depriming or deactivation, and then re-release them into the systemic circulation in a calmed down state so that we don't get secondary lung injury. But that actually when that mechanism fails, the lung itself becomes a source of priming, and that's when we get the lung injury. And I thought I'd try and provide some evidence for that. So one of the earlier studies that looked at some things that were relevant to this was Scott Worthen in the late 80s, and what he showed using rabbits and injecting rabbits with FNLP and LPS, and I've highlighted it in red and blue just to try and make it a bit more obvious, is that actually he could induce neutrophil sequestration in the pulmonary circulation of rabbits in the absence of albumin leak. So it's very possible to have inflammation that the lungs could recognise, retain those neutrophils, but that did not cause vascular leak syndrome and what we would recognise as being a lung injury. And the other thing to note about this is whilst there was initial retention of the neutrophils in these rabbits, over time the neutrophils in those long regions of interest, and this was scintigraphy data, washed out of the pulmonary circulation and began to recirculate again. Moving on a little bit, in the mid-2000s, Kazuo Yoshida, whilst working with Claire Dorschek in the United States, looked at bacterial pneumonia models in rats. And what they demonstrated, and just one set of experiments from their great paper from the Blue Journal, using streptococcal pneumonia, was that if they exposed rats to streptococcus, 4 hours afterwards, they could find that actually they could measure a gradient of neutrophils across the pulmonary circulation. So they would find that there were more neutrophils entering the circulation than leaving. More interestingly than that, they actually found a difference in the priming status, so the activation status of those neutrophils, with more primed neutrophils going into the pulmonary circulation than exiting. And they measured that using F-actin cytoskeletal changes. And just to explain what that means, so the kind of red neutrophils here are ones that don't have F-actin polymerization and therefore are nice and deformable and flow through the pulmonary circulation without difficulty, whereas stained in green here using phytsphiloidin is the F-actin polymerization, which makes the cells less deformable and causes the retention in the pulmonary circulation. So this provided evidence that suggested that actually the lung may have a way of trapping primed neutrophils, and the Worthen data suggested that perhaps those cells in some way were able to wash out later, which led us to do this kind of work. So rodents are great models of many things, but actually what we're trying to model is processes in humans, and there's probably no better way to do that than in humans themselves. So what we did was take healthy volunteers, bleed them, purify their neutrophils, radiolabel them, and expose them to a range of priming agents, and then re-injected them into the healthy volunteers who were lying in a dual-headed gamma camera, and take a series of very rapid images for the first 2 minutes, and then some slightly longer frames for the next 38 minutes. And just to explain the kind of pictures that you get, here you can see the bolus of radiolabeled neutrophils being injected, coming across the subclavian vein, down into the right ventricle, and out into the lungs. When you do this, the kind of thing that you get 40 minutes after injection, and just to explain these a little bit more, the top are vehicle control, so unprimed neutrophils that we re-injected, and these are images from the posterior gamma camera head. So this is the spleen, and this is the liver, and this is the lungs with no neutrophils retained in them. If you use platelet activating factor as your neutrophil priming agent, which has been shown to reversibly prime neutrophils, so maximally priming them at 5 minutes, but actually by 45 minutes, very little of them still remained primed, so the deformability has returned to normal. You can see by priming those cells, running down the corridor, injecting them into my healthy volunteers as fast as possible so that they were still 5 minutes post-exposure to PAF. 40 minutes later, actually there's not much of them left in the lung. But if you do the same thing with GM-CSF, which is a much longer acting neutrophil priming agent, you can see that there's substantial retention of neutrophils in the pulmonary circulation 40 minutes after injection. And just to graph this out, the whole series of data, actually the GM-CSF neutrophils wash out over those 40 minutes such that half of them are still retained. The PAF ones wash out much more rapidly, as you would expect, so they're the same as control by 40 minutes. But what this is showing is that the pulmonary circulation can retain inflamed neutrophils, hold on to them, calm them down, and allow them to wash out of the pulmonary circulation without causing lung injury. To test this in patients, we went to a similar kind of technique that Kazuo Yoshida had used in his mouse and looked at arteriovenous gradients of neutrophils and neutrophil priming across the pulmonary circulation of patients who were having surgery for non-urgent purposes, in this case esophagectomy and cystectomy surgery, people who we knew had sepsis but no evidence of lung dysfunction, and people who had septic etiology lung injury. We found no difference in their neutrophil counts across the pulmonary circulation, and unsurprisingly no difference in their integrin expression on their neutrophils. But what we did find is a significant difference in the CD62L, so L-selectin expression on neutrophils, which is a classical priming marker across the pulmonary circulation, such that if you were septic, you had more primed neutrophils going into your lung than coming out. And if you had ARDS, actually that defense mechanism for depriming had failed and your lung was chucking out lots of primed neutrophils. Interestingly, the degree of failure of depriming correlated with the oxygenation status of the patients who had ARDS. And in a couple of cases where we followed the patients and measured their gradients sequentially, we would see things that looked like this. So we had a patient who had sepsis, who developed ARDS, and we could actually measure the change in the gradient over time. And this married up very well with some data from Charlotte Martin from 1992, who had looked at the priming status of neutrophils in the circulation and found that they correlated closely with the severity of lung injury, but not with the severity of other critical illness such as sepsis. So having a failure of neutrophil depriming was a marker of lung injury, but wasn't a feature of sepsis. So what happens when host defense fails and the pulmonary depriming mechanism fails? Well, these pictures you will have all seen 100 times at least, from Michael Mathey and Lorraine Ware. You get lung injury, which I'm not going to talk about, but the bit that we often forget is that you also get repair. So the things that happen are you get a loss of compartmentalization between the capillaries and the alveolar epithelium, but also you get repair processes, and these two things happen in a heterogeneous way across the lung rather than in a sequential kind of marched process. And when host defense fails and you get this failure of depriming, I would argue that that's when we get the remote organ damage that we see as a consequence of people who get lung injury, and is the topic of a seminar later on this afternoon. And it's probably the explanation why patients with lung injury die of remote organ damage rather than of their primary lung failure. So what I hoped that I might have persuaded you is that the lung plays an important role in host defense from sepsis, and that failure of this host defense is when we get lung injury and remote organ dysfunction. And I thought I'd stop there. Thank you.